Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of English in Practice. It's Kareem with you again, your English teacher. In today's lesson, I'll teach you different ways you can use to give advice in English. That can also help you improve your conversation skills or speaking skills. So keep watching. The first way to give advice is by using the modal should. Now, this is one of the common ways we use in English to give advice. Let's have an example. You should buy a car. You should also notice that after the modal should, we use something called the base form or the bare infinitive. What does that mean? If you look at the sentence again, you can see that after the modal should, we have the verb buy. Now this verb has nothing, has no suffixes, no prefixes, has no ing, no ed, no to, nothing in front of it or before it. A second way to give advice is by using a conditional, and to be more specific, a second conditional. If you use a second conditional to give advice, you're basically showing the person you're talking to what you would do if you were in their position. Let's have an example. If I were you, I would buy a car. Or you can say, I would buy a car if I were you. These two sentences have the same meaning and the same effect, of course, but just different order. Now, if you use the second conditional, as I said, in your sentence to give advice, that means you are basically telling the other person what you personally would do if you were in their position. Another way to say that is by using the idiom to be in someone else's shoes. Now, you won't change the meaning or the effect, but it's just a different way. So our sentence can be something like, if I were in your shoes, I would buy a car, or I would buy a car if I were in your shoes. A third way to give advice in English is to use a question like, why don't you? Now, using, or let me say a question like this can also be used to give advice in English, but it makes a less direct recommendation. Let's have an example. Why don't you buy a car? In this example, I am giving advice to a person, but in a less direct way. Other questions that can be used to give advice are, how about buying a car, or have you thought about buying a car? These two examples have the same meaning and the same effect of the first example we talked about. A fourth way to give advice in English is to use ought to. Now, ought to has the same meaning of should, but there is a small difference. Let's have an example and see the difference. You ought to buy a car. Now, this example basically means that you should buy a car. But the only difference here is that if you use ought to, you're basically being more formal and more polite. And of course, using ought to give advice is not something common, but just in case you hear such a sentence, you know now what it means. A fifth way to give advice is to use verbs like suggest and recommend. Now, sometimes you're not talking to your friends. You need to be formal. Maybe you're giving advice to your boss, your teacher, anyone of a higher rank. So you need to be formal. Now, one way to do that is to use verbs like suggest and recommend. Let's have a look at these examples. I suggest that you buy a car. Or you can say, I suggest buying a car. Using recommend, we can say, I recommend that you buy a car, or I recommend buying a car. As you can see, these four sentences have exactly the same meaning and the same effect. They're all used to talk about or to give advice to people who are not your friends. In other words, these verbs are used to give advice in a very formal way. Use them in a formal context. A sixth way to give advice is to use had better. Now, sometimes you need to emphasize the seriousness of a situation. Sometimes you want to show the person you're talking to that if they don't do what you're advising, they may be in trouble. Let's have an example. You'd better report losing your passport. This example suggests that losing the passport is a big deal here. So I used had better in this sentence to tell you that if you don't report losing your passport, if you don't do what I'm advising, then you may be in trouble. Now, the seventh and last way in today's episode to give advice is to use the verb itself, advise. So you can say, I advise you to buy a car. Now, this sentence basically means that my advice to you is to buy a car. In the end, remember that giving advice to people without being asked may give the wrong impression. So be careful about giving advice and when to give advice. So, today we learned different ways to give advice in English. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new today. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.